I want to tell you about the best 2 years of my life, and then the worst year, and then something that felt like waking up from a bad dream into a morning so clear and quiet you almost don't believe it's real. Pour yourself something warm. This is going to take a while. My name is Dorothy. Dorothy Ann Whitfield, if you want the full version, though most people who've known me longer than 10 minutes just call me Dot. I'm 67 years old, I have a garden that would make you cry, it's so pretty in June, and I still live, I want to be very clear about that word, in the house my husband Gerald and I built together on Clover Hill Road in a small town in Western Virginia called Millhaven. Hey there, sweet friends. If this story is touching your heart even a little, it would mean the world to me if you tap that like button and hit subscribe so we can keep sharing these real moments together. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Gerald passed 8 years ago, pancreatic cancer. 14 weeks from diagnosis to gone, and there isn't a single day I don't think about him. But I'm not here to tell you a grief story. I'm here to tell you what happened after, and specifically what happened with my daughter Karen. Now, right away, when I say my daughter Karen, I know some of you are going to tense up a little. And honestly, if you'd have asked me even 3 years ago, I would have said, hand to God, that Karen was my greatest accomplishment. Not the garden, not the 22 years I spent as a school librarian, not the little watercolor paintings I sell at the farmer's market every fall. Karen, my girl. She was the child Gerald and I tried for almost 4 years to have, 2 miscarriages before her, and when she finally arrived, 8 pounds, 4 ounces, a head full of dark hair, the loudest cry you've ever heard, Gerald actually sat down on the floor of the delivery room and wept. He just sat right down on the linoleum and put his face in his hands and cried happy tears. The nurses loved him for it. We raised Karen in that house on Clover Hill Road. She grew up catching fireflies in the backyard, riding her bike down the long gravel driveway, learning to bake biscuits from scratch at my elbow in that kitchen. She was a good kid, a little headstrong, sure, and she always needed to be the smartest person in the room, but I called that confidence, and I was proud of it. She went to college in North Carolina, came back, married a decent man named Paul, had 2 kids, my grandchildren, Lily and Connor. They lived about 40 minutes south of me, in Roanoke, in a nice subdivision with a homeowners association and a neighborhood pool. We talked on the phone every Sunday. She came up for holidays. We had a good relationship, a genuinely good one. That's what I need you to understand before I tell you the rest. It wasn't like there was always something off with Karen. It wasn't like I should have seen it coming from a mile away. What happened slowly, and it happened at a time when I was tired and a little lonely, and maybe, if I'm being honest, a little scared. Because Gerald had been the one who handled things. Not because I couldn't. I'm no shrinking violet. I taught middle school children to love books for over 2 decades. I can handle myself. But because we divided our life that way, he did the finances, the car maintenance, the taxes. I did the house, the cooking, the social calendar, the kids' school stuff. It worked for us. And when he was gone, suddenly I had to learn all of it, all at once, while also grieving. And it was a lot. For the first 2 years after Gerald died, Karen was wonderful. She was patient. She helped me figure out the investment accounts. She drove up and sat with me while I met with the estate lawyer. She called more often. She checked in. She said things like, "Mom, you are so strong. I don't know how you do it." And I believed her because I needed to and because she seemed to mean it. By year 3 and 4, we'd settled into our new normal. I was managing fine. I'd learned QuickBooks for my little watercolor business. I'd figured out online banking. I'd even learned to use my tablet pretty well, if I do say so myself. I had friends, my book club, my garden club, my neighbor Patrice, who is my age and sharp as a tack and keeps me laughing. I was okay. I genuinely was. And then year 5 came, which is when Karen and Paul got divorced. I'm not going to get into the details of that because it isn't really my story to tell, and also because the details are frankly painful and I've processed them as much as I intend to. What I'll say is this: Paul was the steadier one in that marriage, and Karen handled the end of it badly. There was anger, there was chaos for a while, and for about 6 months she was calling me 3 times a day instead of once a week, and I was grateful to be needed and also completely exhausted. She got the house in the divorce, which was good. She had her job. She's a marketing manager for a medical supply company, makes decent money. She had the kids 50% of the time. She landed on her feet. Karen always lands on her feet. And then, about a year after the divorce was final, she came up to visit me in Millhaven for a long weekend in October, and she sat across from me at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and she said the words that started all of this. She said, "Mom, I've been worried about you." I remember looking at her across that table. The kitchen was warm, the way it gets in October when you've got the oven on and the windows are showing you all that red and gold. I had a pot of soup on. It smelled like thyme and butter. Karen looked concerned, genuinely concerned. Her brow was furrowed the same way it was when she was small and something was bothering her at school. "Worried how?" I said. "Just, Mom, you're here alone, all the way up this hill. It's a long driveway. If something happened to you, how long before someone even knew?" I laughed, not dismissively, just comfortably. "Patrice is right down the road. My book club meets every other Tuesday. I have my phone." "I know," Karen said, "but what if you fell? What if you had a medical thing in the middle of the night?" "Then I'd call 911 like any sensible person." She looked down at her tea. "I just think, at your age, 64? At 64? I know how old you are, Mom." She smiled a little, but it was a careful smile. "I just mean that things can change fast. And this house, it's big. It's a lot to maintain alone. The driveway's a 1/4 mile of gravel. The water heater is, 11 years old?" "11, and it's fine." She nodded slowly, said she just wanted me to think about it. Think about whether living alone made sense long term. She wasn't pushing anything, she said, just bringing it up because she loved me. And I thought, that's sweet. That's my girl being thoughtful. I told her I appreciated it, and we dropped the subject and ate soup and watched a movie, and it was a perfectly lovely weekend. But she brought it up again at Thanksgiving, and again at Christmas, and again when she called in February, that bleak gray February, and I mentioned offhand that I'd slipped on some ice on the back steps and caught myself on the railing. No harm done. She was so alarmed you'd thought I'd told her I'd fallen off a cliff. Mom, that is exactly what I'm talking about. What if you hadn't caught yourself?" "But I did." "But what if you hadn't?" I started to feel, just slightly, the tiniest bit, managed, like she was collecting evidence. But I pushed that thought away because what kind of mother thinks her daughter is collecting evidence? Karen was worried about me. That was a loving thing. By spring, she had a proposal. She called it a creative solution that would be good for both of us. What it was this. She wanted to sell her house in Roanoke and move in with me on Clover Hill Road, her and the kids. Lily was 12, Connor was 9. They'd take the upstairs bedrooms. Karen would take Gerald's old study as a home office. She'd help with expenses, help with the house maintenance, and I'd have family around me. I sat with that for a long moment on the phone. "That's a big change," I said. "It would be good for the kids, too," she said. "More space, fresh air, a grandmother they actually get to see. And honestly, Mom, my house feels too big since Paul left. I rattle around in it." That part got me, the rattling around. I knew that feeling. "Let me think about it," I said. I thought about it for 3 weeks. I talked to Patrice, who said, "Dot, just make sure it's what you want, not just what makes Karen feel better." I talked to Louise from book club, who had her son move in with her, and said it was both wonderful and occasionally maddening. I thought about the fireflies in the backyard, and Lily and Connor catching them the way Karen had as a girl. I called Karen back and said yes. The first few months were genuinely wonderful. I'm not going to lie to you about that because it's important. They moved in July. Karen's furniture filled the house back up in a way that felt like life coming back. The kids were everywhere. Connor in the garden with me, asking questions about every single plant. Lily upstairs doing whatever it is 12-year-olds do with their phones, but coming down for dinner every night and actually talking about her day. Karen was energetic. She made breakfast sometimes. She handled calling the plumber when the downstairs bathroom had a slow drain. She pressure washed the back deck. She was helpful. She was present. She was everything she'd promised. She also had opinions, but I told myself that was fine. Karen had always had opinions. She thought the living room furniture was dated and mentioned it a few times before I said I liked it, and she let it go. She thought I was going to bed too early. She thought I was spending too much time in the garden and not enough time engaging, her word, with the world. She signed me up for an online seniors community without asking me, which I quietly unsubscribed from. Little things. The first truly odd moment came about 4 months in November. I was looking for a bill, my electricity bill, paper copy, because I still like paper copies of things, and I couldn't find it. I looked in the drawer where I always keep my mail sorted, and it wasn't there. I looked on the counter, in the kitchen junk drawer. Nothing. I mentioned it to Karen, and she said, "Oh, I signed you up for paperless billing. It's so much easier, Mom. Everything's online now." I stopped. "You signed me up for my account?" "I have your login," she said, breezy as anything. "I set it up for you last year, remember? When we were figuring out your accounts after Dad died?" I did remember that, but that was years ago, under completely different circumstances, when I was drowning. "I'd like to get paper bills again," I said. She gave me a look that was somehow patient and slightly condescending all at once. "Mom, that's so unnecessary. I'll show you how to check it online." "I know how to check things online," I said. "I'd still like paper." "Okay," she said, with a tone that meant the opposite of okay. I switched the billing back myself the next day. She didn't say anything about it, but something about that exchange sat with me, like a small pebble in my shoe that I kept forgetting was there until I took a step. Thanksgiving came and was beautiful. Christmas came and was beautiful. The grandkids and the tree and the house full of noise. It was exactly what I'd imagined. I told Patrice over the phone that I was so glad Karen had moved in. I meant it. But in January, Karen brought up the house. She brought it up carefully. That's how Karen does things she really wants. Carefully. She had a glass of wine. I had my tea. Kids were in bed, and she sat down across from me at that same kitchen table and said she'd been thinking about something. "I've been looking at property law," she said, "and I think we should add me to the deed of this house." I put my mug down slowly. "Why?" "Because if something happened to you, Mom, God forbid, the house would go through probate. It could take a year, 2 years. The kids and I could be in legal limbo. It would protect all of us if I were already on the deed as a co-owner." I want to be honest with you. My first reaction was not alarm. My first reaction was, that makes some sense. She was living here. The kids were living here. If I had a stroke tomorrow, they'd need stability. "I have a will," I said. "I updated it after your father died. The house goes to you." "I know," she said, "but a will still goes through probate, Mom. It takes time. This is just simpler." "I'd want to talk to my lawyer before I did anything like that," I said. "Of course," Karen said. "That's smart. I would expect nothing less." And she smiled, and I felt reassured, and we finished our wine and tea and went to bed. I called my lawyer's office the next week and left a message with his assistant. His name was Jim Beaumont, and he'd handled Gerald's estate, and I trusted him. His assistant said he was booked for 3 weeks, but she'd have him call me. 3 weeks went by. He didn't call. I got busy with a garden club thing and my February watercolor class. I forgot about it. Karen brought it up again in March. "Did you ever talk to the lawyer?" she asked. Not yet, I said. I'll follow up. I actually know someone, an estate lawyer I connected with through work. He's super sharp, Mom. I could set something up, maybe more efficient than trying to get old Jim on the phone. Jim is perfectly good. I'm sure he is. I'm just saying I have a resource. I'll call Jim, I said. And I did call Jim, and that time he called me back, and we made an appointment for mid-April. I hadn't told Karen about the appointment specifically. I wasn't hiding it exactly. It just didn't come up. At that appointment, Jim listened to me explain what Karen wanted. He had the mild, considered manner of a man who has heard everything and is surprised by very little. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair. Dot, he said, adding someone to the deed of your home is not a minor administrative move. It is a transfer of partial ownership. Once that person is on the deed, you cannot sell the property, refinance it, or make major decisions about it without their agreement. I didn't fully understand that, I said. A lot of people don't, he said. Now, that doesn't mean it's never appropriate, but I'd want you to be very clear on what you're agreeing to. Do you have any concerns about your relationship with your daughter? I looked at him. What kind of concerns? Just in general, he said carefully. Is the living arrangement going smoothly? Do you feel comfortable? Do you feel like you're in control of your home? I said yes, mostly, with a couple of small things. He nodded. He said, I want you to keep my number handy, Dot, and I want you to think carefully before signing anything. If Karen brings you paperwork to sign, anything at all, related to the house or your accounts or anything else, you call me first. You understand? I'm worrying you, Jim, I said. I'm just being thorough. That's what you pay me for. I drove home that day and sat in my car in my own driveway for a few minutes, looking up at the house. It was April and the dogwood was blooming, and it was the most beautiful thing. I told myself Jim was just being a thorough lawyer. That's what they do. I told myself everything was fine. Here's the thing about slow manipulation, and I know the word manipulation sounds dramatic, and at this point in the story, I wasn't even using that word in my own head yet. But here's the thing about it. It works by making you question yourself at every turn. Every red flag comes with a perfectly reasonable explanation attached, and because you love the person, you reach for the explanation every time. By summer, our first full year together, I started noticing things with money. Karen had agreed when she moved in to contribute to household expenses. We hadn't signed anything formal, just had a conversation. She said she'd cover a third of utilities and contribute $500 a month toward groceries and general upkeep. Loose, informal. I didn't push for paperwork because she was my daughter, and it felt cold to do that. The contributions were inconsistent from the start, but I gave grace because she had the kids and the divorce had been costly. By summer, she had paid 2 months and skipped 3, and when I gently brought it up, she got a hurt look on her face and said, Mom, I'm doing so much around here. I'm not sure a cash contribution is the right way to think about what I'm adding to this household. Which, okay, she was doing things, the pressure washing, calling the plumber, but we had an agreement, I said as gently as I could. Things change. I thought we were flexible. We left it unresolved. I didn't push harder because I hated conflict with her, always had. A month later, she told me she switched my streaming services to a family plan to save money, and she'd also simplified my phone plan. Both of these things reduced my monthly bills slightly. I didn't ask to see the details. I should have. Then, and this is where it gets important, my neighbor Patrice called me one afternoon when Karen had taken the kids to swimming lessons. Patrice said in her careful way, Dot, I don't know if this is my business, but Karen stopped me in the driveway last week and asked me some questions that struck me as a little odd. What kind of questions? I said. She asked me how you seemed. whether I'd noticed any, she used the word confusion, whether I'd noticed any confusion or forgetfulness. She asked if I'd ever been concerned about you being alone. Patrice paused. She made it sound like she was asking out of concern, but she was asking me for examples, like she wanted me to give her specific incidents. I felt cold. In July, standing in my warm kitchen, I felt cold. "What did you tell her?" I said. "I told her you were sharp as a tack and I'd never had a moment's concern," Patrice said, "because that's the truth. But why is she asking the neighbors about you?" I said I wasn't sure. I thanked Patrice and hung up, and I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the garden, and I thought about Jim Beaumont saying, "I want you to think carefully before signing anything." When Karen got home with the kids, I watched her. She was happy, chatty, full of stories about Connor's cannonball off the diving board. She helped with dinner. She was warm. She was my daughter. But something had shifted in me. Some careful, quiet part of me had come awake. 2 weeks later, I found the folder. Karen uses the dining room table as a secondary workspace sometimes when she needs to spread things out. I'd come in to set the table for dinner, and she'd swept things into a pile and carried them upstairs, normal enough, nothing suspicious, but she'd missed one paper which had slipped under the edge of the table runner. I picked it up. It was a printout, a government form, and I had to put on my reading glasses and really look at it. It was a form related to power of attorney in Virginia, specifically a durable general power of attorney. I recognized it because I'd signed a limited one for Gerald when he was sick for specific medical purposes. But this was a general one, which, if you don't know what that means, effectively lets one person act on behalf of another in virtually all financial and legal matters. My name was at the top. Karen's name was listed as the agent. The form was not signed, but it was filled out, in Karen's handwriting, already filled out, waiting. I stood at my dining room table holding that piece of paper for a long time. I turned it over. I set it back down. I picked it back up. My hands were not shaking, which surprised me. I felt very still, very focused, the way I used to feel in the library sometimes when a child came to me with a real problem, not a scraped knee, a real problem, and I knew I had to be the calm one. I took the paper to my room and photographed it with my phone. Then I put it back exactly where I'd found it, under the edge of the table runner. At dinner that night, I was completely normal. I made pot roast. We talked about Connor's summer reading list. I laughed at a story Lily told about her friend's cat. I was completely, entirely normal. But inside, something had clicked into place. Not anger, not yet, just clarity. After the kids were in bed and Karen was in her room, I sat in the quiet of my bedroom with the door closed and I thought. Not about what Karen might want, or why she might need it, or whether there was an innocent explanation. I was done with finding innocent explanations. I thought about what I knew, and what I needed to find out, and what I needed to do. First thing in the morning, I called Jim Beaumont's office as soon as they opened. Jim saw me 2 days later. I brought the photo of the form on my phone. He looked at it for a long time, zooming in with his reading glasses perched on his nose. Then he set the phone down and looked at me. I want you to listen to me very carefully." "I'm listening," I said. "A general, durable power of attorney, if you sign this, would give your daughter the legal authority to sell your home, access and transfer your bank accounts, make decisions about your investments, apply for credit in your name, and essentially manage your entire financial life with very limited oversight." "I know," I said, because I'd looked it up the night before, all of it. The fact that she has this form already filled out and has not discussed it with you or brought it to you with a recommendation to consult an attorney, that is a significant concern. She also asked my neighbor about whether I seemed confused, and she's been pushing to get on the deed of the house. Jim was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, not kindly. Do you believe your daughter has your best interests at heart?" I thought about Patrice's face when she told me about the questions Karen had asked. I thought about the power of attorney form filled out in Karen's handwriting hidden under a table runner. I think, I said slowly, that my daughter has a plan and I am a component of that plan. Jim nodded. Okay, then here's what we're going to do. What we were going to do, Jim explained, was threefold. First, I needed to secure my financial accounts, change my passwords and logins, add additional security, make sure Karen had no access. She'd gotten herself on one checking account, which I hadn't fully registered, supposedly to help me manage bills. I also moved the bulk of my savings to a separate account at a different bank, one she didn't know existed. I went back to Jim and we went through my will and my estate documents. Everything was in order, but we added a clause specifically addressing the house, making my intentions absolutely unambiguous. We also made sure there was a letter of instruction, a separate document, that explained my wishes clearly in my own handwriting, witnessed and notarized. Jim said this kind of document, while not legally binding on its own, is enormously helpful if anyone ever tries to challenge competency. I sat very still. Jim said, the very best thing you can do right now is to be demonstrably, documentably competent. Keep records, write things down, date them, save emails and texts. If she asks you to sign anything, tell her you need to have your lawyer review it first, and do not sign it. And for the love of everything, do not let her get on that deed. I drove home and I started. I want to tell you what it feels like to have discovered that someone you love is working against you and then have to go home and live in the same house with them and act normal. It feels like walking through your own home in a dieting suit. Everything is slightly muffled. You move carefully. You breathe deliberately. You smile when it's required and you make dinner and you ask about their day. And underneath all of it is this cold, humming awareness. I was grateful for that awareness. I held on to it like a flashlight in a dark room. Here's what I did systematically over the next 6 weeks. I went to my bank in person, alone, drove myself, and changed every password, removed Karen's name from any account where she had any access at all. She'd gotten herself on one checking account, which I hadn't fully registered, supposedly to help me manage bills. I also added a verbal security password that had to be given before any changes could be made over the phone. I also moved the bulk of my savings to a separate account at a different bank, one she didn't know existed. I went back to Jim and we went through my will and my estate documents. Everything was in order, but we added a clause specifically addressing the house, making my intentions absolutely unambiguous. We also made sure there was a letter of instruction, a separate document that explained my wishes clearly in my own handwriting, witnessed and notarized. Jim said this kind of document, while not legally binding on its own, is enormously helpful if anyone ever tries to challenge competency. I sat very still. Jim said, the very best thing you can do right now is to be demonstrably, documentably competent. Keep records, write things down, date them, save emails and texts. If she asks you to sign anything, tell her you need to have your lawyer review it first, and do not sign it. And for the love of everything, do not let her get on that deed. I drove home and I started. I want to tell you what it feels like to have discovered that someone you love is working against you and then have to go home and live in the same house with them and act normal. It feels like walking through your own home in a diving suit. Everything is slightly muffled. You move carefully. You breathe deliberately. You smile when it's required and you make dinner and you ask about their day. And underneath all of it is this cold, humming awareness. I was grateful for that awareness. I held on to it like a flashlight in a dark room. Here's what I did systematically over the next 6 weeks. I went to my bank in person, alone, drove myself, and changed every password, removed Karen's name from any account where she had any access at all. She'd gotten herself on one checking account, which I hadn't fully registered, supposedly to help me manage bills. I also added a verbal security password that had to be given before any changes could be made over the phone. I also moved the bulk of my savings to a separate account at a different bank, one she didn't know existed. I went back to Jim and we went through my will and my estate documents. Everything was in order, but we added a clause specifically addressing the house, making my intentions absolutely unambiguous. We also made sure there was a letter of instruction, a separate document that explained my wishes clearly in my own handwriting, witnessed and notarized. Jim said this kind of document, while not legally binding on its own, is enormously helpful if anyone ever tries to challenge competency. I bought a small notebook, one of those moleskin ones from the drugstore, and I started writing things down. Dates, times, what Karen said, what I said, any requests she made. Not in an accusatory way, just facts. March 14th, Karen asked again about the deed. Said, quote, "Mom, you really need to think about protecting us." I said I was thinking about it. She sighed and said I was making things harder than they needed to be. I called Patrice and told her, quietly, a little of what was happening. Not everything, but enough that she understood to be a witness if needed, and enough that she wasn't going to be a source Karen could use. Patrice was furious on my behalf, but she is a steady woman, and she channeled it into helpfulness. She said, "You tell me what you need, Dot." I called my doctor and scheduled a full checkup, including a cognitive screening, proactively. I told my doctor why I was doing it. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Anita Reyes, and when I explained the situation, she said, "Good, you're thinking clearly and acting wisely, and I'm going to document all of that." She ran every test. I scored, she told me, in the top range for my age group on every cognitive measure. She wrote up a thorough report, and I got a copy. I also called my son-in-law, my ex-son-in-law, Paul. That was a hard call to make. Paul and I had always gotten along, and I hated that the divorce had put distance between us, but I needed to understand the landscape. We talked for a long time. He was careful about what he said regarding Karen, but what came through clearly was this. Karen had come out of the divorce with less money than she'd expected because Paul had fought harder than she'd anticipated, and she was carrying significant credit card debt. And then, Paul paused for a long time, he said, "Dot, Karen talked a lot during the marriage about eventually inheriting Clover Hill Road. She talked about it like it was her retirement plan." I thanked him and sat with that for a while. The picture was becoming so clear it almost surprised me that I hadn't seen it sooner, but I forgave myself for that. Love is not stupid. Love is just love. It makes us interpret evidence generously, and there is nothing wrong with that. Until there is. I had been quiet and careful for almost 2 months when Karen made her biggest move. She came to me on a Sunday evening with printed papers and a smile on her face, like she was bringing me a birthday present. "Mom, I've been working on something," she said and spread the papers on the kitchen table. "I worked with that attorney I mentioned, the real estate one, and he put together a package that addresses everything. The house, your accounts, your estate plan. It's all coordinated. All you need to do is sign a few things and everything is protected." I looked at the papers without touching them. There were 4 documents. One was the deed amendment to add Karen as a joint tenant with rights of survivorship, meaning if I died, she automatically got the house without probate. One was the general power of attorney I'd found under the table runner, now with a notary block ready. One was an amendment to my bank accounts, adding Karen as a joint owner. And the last one was something called a personal care agreement, which designated Karen as my sole healthcare decision maker. "You had an attorney prepare all of this?" I said. "He was really helpful," Karen said. "He said this is a really common package for aging parents living with adult children." I noticed she said aging parents. I was 66 at that point. "I'll need to have Jim Beaumont review all of this before I sign anything." Something changed in her face, just briefly, like a cloud crossing the sun. "Mom, Jim Beaumont is 90 years old." He's 68. He's old-fashioned. This attorney is really current on Virginia law. I just think maybe we don't need to add a step here." "I'm going to add the step," I said. Karen looked at me steadily for a moment, and then she said something I will never forget. She said, "Mom, I'm doing all of this because I'm scared for you. I need you to understand that. You forget things sometimes, small things, but I notice, and I need to know that if something happens, if you have an episode of some kind, that I'm in a position to take care of things. You understand? I'm trying to protect you." I looked at her, my daughter. The baby Gerald sat down on the floor and cried over, the little girl who caught fireflies. "What do you forget?" I said quietly. She waved a hand. "Just little things, you know." "No," I said, "specifically. What specifically have you seen me forget?" She got a little flustered then. "Well, you left the stove on last month." "Once," I said, "the burner, not the oven, for about 20 minutes while I was in the garden. You've left the stove on too, Karen. Everybody leaves the stove on." "Mom, I will have Jim review those documents and I will be in touch." I collected the papers from the table because I intended to take them to Jim. Karen's hand actually came out to stop me and then thought better of it. That night was tense. I could feel it through the house, a low vibration. Karen didn't come back downstairs. The kids were quiet, probably feeling it too without knowing why. I sat in my room and photographed every one of those 4 documents. Then I texted Jim's personal cell, which he'd given me. I said, "I need to see you as soon as possible. She made her move." He replied within 10 minutes, "Tuesday morning, 9 a.m. Jim looked at all 4 documents. He took his time. He made notes on his own pad. Then he called a colleague of his, a woman who specialized in elder law, and she joined us by phone. Her name was Margaret Chen, and she was direct to the point of bluntness, which I found enormously reassuring. "Okay, let's be clear about what's being attempted here," Margaret said. "The deed change creates automatic inheritance outside of probate or the will, and it also means from the moment of signing, Karen has co-ownership veto power over everything to do with the property. The power of attorney is drafted extremely broadly, with essentially no limitations. The bank account co-ownership would give her immediate access to all funds with no restrictions. And the personal care agreement as written is, frankly, aggressive. It can be used to support a guardianship petition." "A guardianship petition?" I asked. "Can you explain that to me like I'm not a lawyer?" Margaret said, "If someone wants to be declared your legal guardian, they go to court and argue you can't manage your own affairs. If they've already established themselves as your financial manager, your property co-owner, and your designated healthcare decision-maker, and if they have neighbors or other witnesses suggesting confusion, they are building that case. If granted, a guardian can make all decisions for you, where you live, your medical care, your money, all of it." The room was very quiet. I said, "This is criminal?" "It walks a fine line," Margaret said. "Elder financial abuse is a crime in Virginia, but it's difficult to prosecute when the documents are signed voluntarily. The goal is to make sure you never sign those documents and then to address the living situation." "I need her out of my house," I said. It was the first time I'd said it out loud. It felt strange and sad, and also like taking a breath after being underwater. "Yes," Margaret said, "you do. And here's the thing, Dot. She's not on the deed, her name is not on the lease because there is no lease, and she has no legal tenancy established in writing. You will need to follow proper legal notice procedures for Virginia, but your position here is very strong." Jim and Margaret outlined the plan. "I need you to understand how carefully this was constructed. We weren't rushing. We weren't acting on emotion. Every single step was designed, sequenced, reviewed." Over the next 6 weeks, I gathered and organized everything. I gave Jim the notebook I'd been keeping. I gave him my photographs of the documents. I wrote out a full timeline, every incident, every request, every odd moment, dating back to the beginning, to that October visit when Karen said she was worried about me. Jim had a colleague type it up properly, and I reviewed it and signed it. Dr. Reyes wrote a formal letter on letterhead, notarized, documenting my cognitive assessment results, my general health, and her clinical opinion that I was fully competent to manage my own affairs. That letter went into a file. Patrice wrote a statement about the questions Karen had asked her and gave her own observations about my mental sharpness. Patrice is a retired nurse, and her statement was precise and clinical and would be hard to argue with. Paul sent me a written statement. He was willing to do that, bless his heart, about Karen's comments during their marriage regarding Clover Hill Road as her expected inheritance and about her current financial situation. My watercolor business records and bank records showed consistent, rational financial management over the past 8 years. Jim included those too. And Margaret Chen identified something else. When she looked more carefully at my bank records, the one account Karen had gotten herself on, she found something. Over the past 8 months, Karen had made 17 transfers from that account to her personal account. Small amounts, $50 here, $120 there, $65. Nothing that would alarm you on its own. Total across all 17, $1,430. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was theft from her own mother. Regular, deliberate, careful theft. I looked at that spreadsheet Margaret had put together, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger. I was past anger by then. More like the last piece of a puzzle clicking into place. I didn't do this carelessly. I didn't imagine it. It was real, and here was the proof. "What can we do with this?" I asked. "Quite a lot," Margaret said. On a Tuesday morning in September, a Tuesday I had chosen because Karen had a work call that morning and wouldn't be ramping up for a fight, Jim came to the house. He came with a formal notice. It was a notice of termination of occupancy. Because Karen had no lease, no written tenancy agreement, and no ownership stake in the property, she was legally a licensee, someone there with permission which I was now revoking. Virginia law required me to give 30 days' notice in that case. The notice was formal, signed by Jim as my attorney, and gave her 30 days to vacate. I handed it to her at the kitchen table. Karen read it. She went very still. Then she looked up at me, and there was something in her face, not the hurt I might have expected, not even shock exactly, more like calculation. She was already thinking about her next move. "Mom," she said. "You should read it all the way through," I said. "I'm not leaving," she said. "You are," I said, "within 30 days. If you have questions, you can direct them to Jim." "You can't do this. I'm your daughter. This is insane. You're acting completely—" "Completely what?" I said. She stopped, because she knew, I think, that whatever word she chose was going to land wrong. "I'm going to contest this," she said. "That's your right," I said. "Jim and Margaret will handle my response." Karen sat at that table for a long moment, and I sat across from her, and it was nothing at all like that warm October morning with the soup and the tea. It was September and bright and hot outside, and the kitchen was very quiet. "You're making a mistake," she said. Her voice was different now, flat. "No," I said. "I don't think so." I got up and went out to the garden. I want to be honest with you. The next 4 weeks were not easy. Karen's response was to go on offense. She called family members. I have a sister in Tennessee, Nancy, and Karen called Nancy within 24 hours and told her that I was not well and was making erratic decisions and that she was worried about me. Nancy called me alarmed, and I explained the situation calmly and sent her the spreadsheet with the bank transfers. Nancy was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Oh, Dot," and she called Karen back and told her that she would be calling a lawyer herself if Karen kept spreading stories. Karen then contacted a doctor, not my doctor, a different one, some general practice in Roanoke, and tried to schedule some kind of evaluation for me, which, naturally, that doctor's office could not schedule without my consent, and I had not given it, but the attempt was documented. She also posted things on Facebook, vague, emotional things about fighting for my family and doing what's right for my mother. People who didn't know the situation left sympathetic comments. People who did know the situation, Patrice, Louise from book club, did not engage. I didn't post anything. My lawyer strongly advised against social media, and I agreed. What's on the internet is there forever, and I had nothing to prove in a public forum. Then, 22 days into the 30, she still hadn't made any real move to leave. She'd hired an attorney herself, someone from Roanoke, and that attorney sent Jim a letter arguing that Karen had established residency rights through long-term occupancy and could not be evicted on 30 days' notice. It was not an entirely unreasonable argument. These things can get complicated. Jim and Margaret were ready for it. They'd anticipated it. What happened next required me to file a formal unlawful detention action in the General District Court. I'm not going to lie to you and say that was easy. Going to court, even just filing paperwork, even when you're in the right, is exhausting and stressful and expensive. I spent money on lawyers I had planned to spend on other things. I had nights where I sat in my garden after dark and just felt the weight of it. But I kept reminding myself, this is my house, my name is on the deed, my husband and I built this house, and there was a spreadsheet somewhere with 17 transfers totaling $1,430, and that spreadsheet was mine too. The court date was a Monday in late October. I want to describe this to you because I think sometimes people have a very Hollywood idea of courtroom scenes, and real life is quieter and stranger and ultimately more satisfying. It was a general district court, a modest room, not a grand courtroom, a judge, some folding tables essentially, a court clerk. Karen was there with her attorney. I was there with Jim and Margaret. Karen had a nice blazer. She looked together, composed. I'd always admired that about her. Margaret had prepared my case meticulously. She had my deed. She had the 30-day notice properly served. She had documentation of Karen's lack of formal tenancy agreement. She had documentation, gently, carefully introduced, of the power of attorney form found in my home, the financial documents Karen had presented, the unauthorized bank transfers. She had Dr. Reyes's cognitive assessment letter. She had my witness statement. She had Paul's statement. She had my timeline, signed, notarized. She had everything. Karen's attorney made his arguments. He was competent, not brilliant. He argued residency by length of stay. He argued Karen had financial entanglement with the property through her contributions. He hinted, and this was the move I'd been waiting for, at my capacity to manage my own affairs. Margaret was ready for that. She handed the judge Dr. Reyes's letter before the attorney had finished his sentence. She had my cognitive testing results. She had 8 years of financial records showing consistent, rational management of my affairs. My watercolor business, my book club, my garden club. She had, and this made me feel something I can't quite name, a letter from the director of the Mill Haven Public Library, where I'd been a regular visitor and occasional volunteer for years, describing my consistent, engaged, intellectually curious presence over the past 8 years. I was so well documented. I was the most documented person who ever lived. The judge was a woman about Karen's age, maybe a little older. She read everything carefully. She asked Karen's attorney a few pointed questions about the basis for his residency claim, and his answers didn't satisfy her. She asked Margaret a couple of clarifying questions. She looked at the bank transfer spreadsheet for a long time. Then she ruled. She ruled in my favor. She ruled that Karen had no tenancy rights and was required to vacate the property. She issued a writ of possession, which meant I had the right to have law enforcement enforce the vacate order if Karen did not leave voluntarily. Karen sat very still when the judge read the ruling. I sat very still, too. I knew Jim and Margaret felt confident, but you never know until you know. Karen's attorney said something to her in a low voice. She turned and looked at me, across that courtroom, across everything, and I looked back at her. I don't know what she was looking for. I hope she didn't find it, whatever it was. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I just looked back at her with steady eyes, the way I have looked at every problem in my life, because that is who I am. She left within a week. She left with the kids and the furniture she'd brought and a few other things. And I want to be scrupulously fair, she did not take anything that wasn't hers. I think the presence of legal proceedings had focused her mind considerably. On the last day, I stayed in my bedroom while the moving truck was being loaded. I sat in the chair by the window and I watched the dogwood tree, which had dropped its leaves by then and was just bare, beautiful branches against the October sky. Lily came to my door before they left and stood there looking uncertain and young, and I got up and hugged her for a long time and told her that I loved her and that would never change. Connor came in after, and I hugged him too. I told them both to keep reading, keep growing things if they got the chance, and to call their grandmother whenever they wanted to. They left. Because this isn't just a story about the moment of justice. It's about what justice actually does. Margaret filed a complaint with the Virginia State Bar regarding the attorney Karen had used to prepare those documents, the power of attorney and the others. The filing raised questions about whether that attorney had properly assessed my competency and consent before preparing documents to be presented to me without independent counsel. That investigation is ongoing as far as I know. I hope it goes wherever it should go. Margaret also consulted with the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office about the bank transfers. $1,430 of unauthorized transfers from your elderly parent's account is elder financial abuse under Virginia law. A criminal complaint was filed. I understand that Karen was contacted by investigators. I understand there were conversations and negotiations. I was not involved in those conversations directly. I left it to the legal process. What I know is that Karen made restitution of the full amount, plus interest, plus some additional amount I won't specify because it's still technically under some kind of agreement, and she received what I'm told is a serious formal warning about what prosecution would look like if there were ever another incident. She also, and this one I didn't expect, lost her job about 4 months later. Not directly related to any of this officially. Her company did a reorganization. But I wonder sometimes about social media posts she'd made and whether they'd been seen by the wrong people. I genuinely don't know. I'm not glad about it exactly. I'm not going to pretend I'm not glad at all because that would be dishonest. But it wasn't something I caused. Her relationship with her own attorney turned out to be contentious as well. I understand there's a fee dispute. Again, not my doing. As for me, I had the kitchen repainted in a soft green I'd always wanted and Gerald had always been lukewarm on. I built 2 new raised garden beds with the help of my neighbor's son who is strong and works cheap. My watercolors this past farmer's market season were the best I'd ever done. There was something in them, some quality that people responded to. I sold out before noon. My book club read an excellent novel about a woman who reinvents herself in her 60s, and we had a lively, heated, wonderful discussion about it. Dr. Reyes told me at my last checkup that my blood pressure was the best it had been in 5 years. Patrice and I walk 2 miles every morning when the weather permits. We talk about everything. We have become, in that particular way that sometimes happens between women of a certain age who've seen things, completely essential to each other. I talk to Lily and Connor on the phone. Karen and I do not speak, and I do not think we will for some time, if ever. I have grieved that. I have genuinely grieved it in the quiet of evenings in my garden, the way you grieve something you loved that stopped being what you thought it was. I don't think Karen was always calculating. I think the divorce broke something in her, and she rebuilt herself around a bad idea. I think she talked herself into believing that she was entitled to what I had because she thought she needed it more than I did. I think she convinced herself that taking care of me and taking from me were the same thing, but they weren't. This is my house, my name on the deed alone, the way it's always been since Gerald died and the estate was settled. My garden, my kitchen, my raised beds, my 11-year-old water heater that is still running fine, thank you very much. My gravel driveway, a 1/4 mile long, that I drive up and down every single day in my own car. I am 67 years old, and I live alone on Clover Hill Road in Mill Haven, Virginia, and I have never been more at home in my life. 2 weeks after the court date, I opened the front door in the morning to get the paper. Yes, I still get a paper. I like a paper. And I looked out at the driveway and the dogwood tree and the sky going pink over the ridge. And I thought about the sheriff's deputy who had come in the end to deliver the writ of possession and the look on Karen's face when she opened the door to him. She told me I was too old to live alone. The sheriff showed up at her door instead. The dogwood blooms every April whether anyone is watching or not, and this year I sat on the back porch with my coffee and watched it all by myself, and it was exactly, completely enough.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.